Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 670 for the 8th of Tishrei in a regular year. So as I've mentioned previously on this podcast, there's something called a leap year versus a regular year. And the Tanya is actually divided up differently depending on whether it's a leap year or whether it's a regular year. So it happens to be that the first year that I began recording this podcast, it was a leap year. So I recorded these episodes in accordance with the division of the Tanya according to the leap year. This year is a regular year, so I've been going through the Tanya once again, dividing it up according to the regular year. So for many of these episodes, the division is very different. So the kind of the thematic basis of it is going to be different than it was last year. The way that the episode is divided up is going to be, it's either longer or shorter, the portion of the Tanya that we read based on, in comparison to what we did last year for the leap year. But sometimes there are days where a day that we're reading this year on a regular year actually lines up exactly with with a day that we read during a leap year, even if it's not the exact corresponding day. So, little disclosure about the It Is Taught podcast. On days such as that, if I was content with the episode that I recorded in the leap year, namely last year, then I'll just go in and edit the beginning portion where I say the date, but then I'll just pretty much put in the same episode that I did last year if I feel like that it's good enough to put out again into the public. So the reason why I mentioned this is that today is one of those days. So, for context, last year when I recorded this episode, it was for the 4th of Tishrei in a leap year. For this year, it's the 8th of Tishrei in a regular year. And the reason why the timing of this matters is because it was interesting that we're going to be talking about royalty in today's episode. And Queen Elizabeth II had actually passed away just a few weeks before I had recorded this episode. And as you'll see, as we go through the episode, I relate to this to some of the things that we'll be discussing. So just to give you a little bit of context about today's episode. And I'll be totally honest, I am not really one of those people that follows the royal family at all, really. I actually don't know much about Queen Elizabeth II at all, but I have a lot of friends who do, who are really obsessed with her and with the royal family. Several friends of mine have recommended the show The Crown to me, which is, from what I understand, a dramatized version of the royal family on Netflix. And supposedly, according to them, there's just a lot to be learned about royalty and just what that means. And they find it very inspirational and educational and fascinating and all of that stuff. So I personally never really got into it. However, I'm kind of more fascinated by the idea of everybody else or many people being fascinated with this stuff. And what is it exactly about royalty, the royal family, about Queen Elizabeth, Princess Diana, all these things? Why are we as a society, why do we gravitate and look up to these people so much? So perhaps today's Tanya will give a little bit of an insight into that, because today's Tanya is actually all about royalty, but royalty not in a physical sense, but rather in a spiritual sense. And we know that there's a principle that everything in the world is a reflection of, like, physicality is a reflection of spirituality. So whatever we see down here is a reflection of something spiritual. So the royal family, in a sense, whenever we see a king and a queen, these are reflections of royalty above. So we are actually supposed to give respect. It's not just a superficial thing. There's a Torah mandate to give respect to royalty. There's actually a prayer that you say, a blessing that you say upon seeing royalty. So it's a real thing. It's something really to be acknowledged. And today we're going to be learning about the spiritual roots of royalty, the spiritual roots of what we know in Hebrew as Malchus, and what that's all about. And specifically speaking about Malchus, royalty, and a king, specifically talking about a king, talking about the king's nation, and then talking about the king's crown and the king's relationship to his crown and how interconnected they are on a spiritual level. So if you've been following along these episodes for a while, then this term Malchus, royalty, might sound familiar to you. It's come up several times. And what it is in the context of spirituality, of the sphere of Hasidus, of Kabbalah, is that when we look at the map of the spheros, the map of the spiritual energies, which are the basis of all of our reality, the Malchus is actually one of those spheros. There's 10 spheros in total, and the last one, the final one, is Malchus, is royalty. Another thing that's interesting about it, not only is it the last of all of the spheros, it's actually the only one that is feminine, interestingly enough. So when we look at the outline of the spheros, this is a little bit of a review for some of you, unless you're newer to the podcast. We know that there's 10 spheros in total. And those 10 spheros are subdivided into the first 3, which are known as the intellectual spheros, meaning that they manifest light, whether we're talking about God's light or whether we're talking about it in a person, because we all contain with us a reflection of these spheros as well. These are the intellectual energies. For today, we're really going to be focusing more on God, and we're going to be focusing on how these energies manifest within godliness in the godly realm. So there's the 3 intellectual energies. There's the Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at. And then we have the 7 emotive energies. These are the more emotionally based spheros. And within those, there's a subdivision as well. There's the first 6, which are masculine. They're known as the Zer Anpin, otherwise known as the small face. And then there's Malchus, which is at the end. The Zer Anpin, the small face, is the first 6, which is, again, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yisod. And then Malchus at the end, which is the 7th, and it's also the feminine. Now, we're really going to hone in on Malchus today. We're really going to examine it and look at what is this attribute of Malchus. And the reason why are we suddenly talking about this? Why are we talking about sovereignty and royalty and all that stuff? Is because in the context of our broader discussion of what we've been discussing in this epistle that we've been learning, which is Epistle 20 of Iggeres HaKodesh, is we've been talking about the uniqueness of creation ex nihilo, which ultimately translates into, it's going to lead us into understanding the uniqueness of our worlds that we live in, the uniqueness of us in the scheme of creation. There are many spiritual worlds above ours, many very lofty beings and angels and souls and all that kind of stuff. But there's something really unique about us, about humanity, about the earth that we live on, the world that we live in. And that uniqueness is this creation of ex nihilo. And we spoke about this yesterday in the past couple of episodes about how this power of ex nihilo really is a reflection of God's essence in a way that nothing else is, because the other alternative to creation ex nihilo is creation something from something, which is more of a causality kind of creation where there's a cause and effect. And creation ex nihilo it's like it transcends cause and effect. It's not about causality anymore. It's this jump where there's nothingness and then there's something from there. And so the focus today on Malchus, this focus on this energy of sovereignty, of royalty, why are we focusing on this? Because, and we already mentioned this yesterday, but today we're really going to focus on it, is that this power of this creation of ex nihilo, where does it come from? Where's the origin of it, the source of it? Like, where does God draw this power from? Is from this attribute specifically of Malchus, this attribute of sovereignty, which at first glance might seem really strange, because if we're saying that the creation ex nihilo is really like the most intense, greatest type of creation, that's the most manifestation of God's energy in an essential way, then you would think that would be coming from God's highest power, not his lowest. Malchus is the lowest, right? So how does that work exactly? And so today we're really going to discuss that. We're going to talk about what it is about Malchus in specific that gives this special energy. And what we'll actually learn is that while on first glance Malchus appears to be the lowest, and it is the lowest in a certain sense, it's also the highest in another sense, and that the beginning is really wedged in the end, and that this is represented by the crown that the king wears, and that this crown that the king wears reminds us of the inherent power in the king, the uniqueness of a king, the uniqueness of royalty, is that on the one hand, the king is a king of nations. So it's like very much associated with the people, like the Queen Elizabeth. One thing I know about her, I don't know much, but one thing I know about her is that she was known as the people's queen. So it was like the thing that was really special about her is that she was so relatable, people said. So that is representative of a good queen or a good king. A good king or a good queen is somebody who is relatable to their people. There's this idea of en melech belo am, there's no king without a nation. Like the whole definition of a king is their subject. It's like, imagine what could be sadder, what could be like a more kind of pathetic imagery than a king or a queen sitting all by themselves in a room with their crown on, and nobody knows them, or like they walk out into the street and nobody recognizes them, nobody knows who they are, like then it's like, can we even call them a king or a queen at that point, if like it's like a king or a queen over who? So the greatness of a king or a queen is really seen in their subjects. It's really seen in how their subjects think of them, talk about them, how many subjects they have, and that kind of thing, right? On the other hand, there's the kind of like this paradoxical element of a king or a queen in the sense that yes, they may be very relatable to the people, but they're also removed. Supposedly the show The Crown, which I've never seen, really shows how there's like this etiquette, this protocol that the royal family has to abide by that's very, very, very specific, that really distinguishes them from anybody else, so that they're really not like other people. So as relatable as Queen Elizabeth was, as much of the quote unquote like people's queen as she was still the queen. She would not be found wearing like jeans and a t-shirt. She had to wear very specific clothing. She had to walk a very specific way, speak a specific way, like very distinct characteristics that made her distinguishable as being a queen. So there's something about royalty that on the one hand, it's all about the people. On the other hand, it's very, very much removed from the people. And we'll learn about this today, and we'll learn about how this is specifically this attribute of Malchus and what makes this attribute of Malchus so powerful. And that is why specifically this attribute of Malchus is the origin, is the source, the powerhouse from which this creation ex nihilo can happen. So with all of that being said, let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this. And for context, we are in the middle of Epistle 20 of Iggeres HaKodesh. And so the Alter Rebbe begins and he says that it's known that however, he says, it's known that the mainstay of the bringing into being of the yesh, of the somethingness, and something that is totally separate, comes from Malchus of Atzilus. So what's with the however? So basically it's like this is just continuing from yesterday. Yesterday we left off with speaking about the vessels and speaking about how it's specifically the vessels that are found within the world of Atzilus that are responsible for the creation ex nihilo, and that's where the power of ex nihilo happens. And so now the Alter Rebbe is getting even more specific. He's saying that, okay, but if we want to really say where's the main part, it's like not just the vessels. We're talking about within the world of Atzilus, it's specifically within the world, within the Malchus of Atzilus, that aspect of Atzilus, the Malchus of Atzilus. And then he says that this Malchus of Atzilus becomes Atik of Bria. Okay, so before you get overwhelmed by all that terminology, let me explain that a little bit. So remember, we have our map of the spheros, and usually the way we've been discussing the map of the spheros is where the first one is Chochmah, and then it's Bina, and then Das, and then Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus, right? That's the standard map of the spheros. However, you'll find times where actually the spheros are slightly different, outlined slightly differently, where there's actually no Das. That third sphera is missing. It's not there. And what we have instead is we have another sphera that's found above Chochmah and Bina, and that's the sphera of Keter. Crown, it means in Hebrew. And that Keter represents will, the power of will. It also represents the power of pleasure, and it also represents the power of faith. So to really get into that is a much bigger discussion for another time. But the basic idea is that why do we have these two maps? Is it depends on your orientation. When we're orienting from a human perspective, from down here, then it makes sense to have the Chochmah Bina Das paradigm. That's where it's like we kind of start with the conscious intellect, because that's what we know consciously. We have this conscious experience, and then it's all about getting to that Das place, that place of integration of the intellect that can give birth to the emotions, as we've discussed previously in previous episodes. However, when we're looking at it from a higher perspective, from the perspective of above to below, then we start with Keser. And then it's all about having, like, it's more of this like space of seeing potential. So it's like we're seeing, like, okay, what is it that I want? And this want can bring about all these things. So the Das is missing because we're not actually living this reality just yet. Right now, we're just like seeing the potential. We're moving from the place of Keter. So to put this in really simple terms, the basic idea is that Keser, the way that we can think of Keser, sometimes it's included in the map of the spheros, sometimes it's not, but it's always there. It's just there in a way that we can think of it as it's like primordial. It comes from before the Chochmah. It precedes Chochmah. And now within this level of Keter, there's actually two main levels within it. There's the level of Atik, Yomin, and the level of Arich, Anpin. Atik Yomin is the higher aspect of Keter, which literally means ancient of days, and its soul power is the power of pleasure. And Arich Anpin, which is a long face, it literally means that corresponds to the power of will. So again, this is, if we get too deep into this, it's going to take another hour or so just to really describe these terms. But the basic thing that you need to know for the sake of our discussion right now is that the highest level of Keter is Atik Yomin, or pleasure. And so now what's happening here, going back to our text, so the interesting thing here is that we say, when we were talking about the Malchus of Atzilus, that's how we started our discussion, the Malchus of Atzilus, the sovereignty, the royalty of Atzilus, that becomes the Atik of Bria. That becomes the highest level of Bria, which is the world below Atzilus. So what that's basically saying in simple English is that the lowest level, the lowest rung of one world becomes the highest rung of the world below it. And then the Alter Rebbe brings the citation of Ki en melech belo am chulei, so that there is no king without a nation. This is how he explains this idea. This is like sort of the deeper idea that there's a connection between the king, which is Malchus, and the world which is below him, which is whatever world that is, and that's going to be the Atik of the world below it. So in this case, it's like the Malchus of Atzilus becomes the Atik of Bria. Okay, so also now another aspect of Malchus, so that's one aspect of Malchus. One aspect of Malchus is this thing of there is no king without a nation, which is like there's a relationship to the lower realms. The second aspect of Malchus is that all of the diversity and the differences in the different types of creatures that come about through this power of the Ein Sof, through this power of God, ultimately, which is totally united with him, which this is what we spoke about yesterday, is this idea that like this power of creation, this power of Ex Nihilo creation specifically comes about through the essence of God. It does not come about just through different soul powers. It's coming from God's essence. So the Alter Rebbe here says that this comes about, this manifestation of God's essence comes about through which manifests in the diversity of creation and the different types of creatures that we have in the world come about through the multiplicity of the letters that come from the Malchus, Pi Hashem, from the sovereignty of the mouth of God. That the spirit of his mouth created everything. So we spoke about this previously in Tanya, going way back to Shargachut V'Amunah. We talked about this idea of how God creates everything through his speech. And we actually can think about this in a physical way when we think about physical royalty, the decree of the king, anything the queen, like whatever the queen would say. Again, I'm not a big expert when it comes to the royal family, but from what I understand, it's like when the queen would say something, that was like, wow, like that was like oh my gosh, like that's sort of like the word of the king, the decree of the king. That's where the power really gets manifest. And so here too, when it comes to God, lahavdil, we see that this is true as well. That we see that the entirety of the universe comes about specifically the way God creates the world is through His speech. So there's something about speech specifically, and speech is the power of Malchus. Speech is corresponds every sphera has a different like kind of energy associated with it. So the energy, the soul power that's associated with Malchus is the power of speech. And we know that the what is speech? Speech, there's 5 articulations of the mouth, and these 5 articulations of the mouth their origin is from the 5 gvuras of Nukva, of the female element of Malchus. So this is, again, a very deep Kabbalistic concept, but basically the 5 articulations of the mouth, which are where speech comes from, come from the 5 severities that are found within Malchus. So again, it's all about Malchus. Malchus and speech are very interconnected, intertwined. And this is why Malchus of Atzilus, which is like the essential Malchus, is called Alma des Galia. It's called the revealed world, because this is where the revelation of the power of the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light, to create something from nothing, really becomes revealed. So this is where that revelation happens of this power of Ex Nihilo happens, is in this Malchus of Atzilus, which is in contrast to the causality type of creation, the creation through Ilav Alo, through cause and effect that we've spoken about. So, which is, and where do we see this causality type of thing happening? This is in the 9 preceding spheros. So the 9 spheros came about. There was an evolutionary process. So if you look at that outline of the 10 spheros, the first 9 spheros, Chochma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, that chain, that has an evolutionary progression to it. So Chochma gives birth to Bina. The union of Chochma and Bina gives birth to Das. Das gives birth to Chesed. Chesed gives birth to Gvura. The union of Chesed and Gvura gives birth to Tiferet. Tiferet gives birth to Netzach. Netzach gives birth to Hod. And the union of Netzach and Hod gives birth to Yesod. So it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. And so there really is this like evolutionary flow through those 9 spheres. But then after Yesod, then we have Malchus, and Malchus it's different. This is where there's like a disconnect. It's not this Ila and Alo. It's not this causality anymore. It's something new. It's this creation ex nihilo. And so this is where God's essential light is manifest. Whereas when it comes to the other 9 spheres, says the Alter Rebbe, the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light of God, actually only gets vested in Chochma, which is like that first sphere, right? And then through it getting vested in Chochma, then it flows through the other spheres, through this like progressive kind of channel. However, when it comes to Malchus, there's something else going on. It's something a lot more intense, a lot higher. And what is that? So the Alter Rebbe brings here a citation from Sefer Yetzirah, which is a Kabbalistic book from chapter 1:7, paragraph 7, where it says, Na'utz tchilatan besofan. The beginning is wedged in the end. So what does that mean? That means the beginning it's not Chochma that you might think. Chochma is like the first. It's like it's called the first Reshit. It's the first consciousness, the first sphera from our perspective. But the very beginning is actually before that. The very beginning is in Keter. Keter, again, is that crown. It's the origin of Chochma. It's where everything comes from. It's primordial Chochma. And it is this place of pleasure and will and all of that. So Keter is the memutza. Keter is the intermediary between the emanator and the emanated. And it has this aspect within it of the last part of the Ein Sof. So what does this mean? So if you've been following along, we saw that there's a connection between the end and the beginning. Like this thing, the last part of the Malchus of Atzilus becomes the Keter of Bria. So there's always this connection between the lowest part and the highest part. So when we say Keter, that means when we're talking about Keter, there's always a Malchus that comes from before that. So that means that we call it Keter Malchus, which is because there can't. So it's the crown of the king, because there cannot be a crown unless there's a king, right? So that's basically the basic idea, is that just like you can't have a king without a crown, like what is a king without their crown? What is a crown without a king? Like if you just have a crown there, what good is that crown? What is the crown? Who wears that crown? The only person that should wear that crown is the king. So there's a connection between the crown and the king, meaning to say that whenever we see that we talk about this aspect, just like anytime we talk about this aspect of Malchus, it's saying that there's a connection to something which is below it. And that's going to bring about that keter. Similarly, from the other perspective, when we're talking about keter, that means that it's connected to the lowest rung above it. So just like the Malchus of Atzilus creates the Keter of Bria, that means the Keter of Bria comes from the Malchus of Atzilus, in other words, right? And so in this case, what we're saying here is that so too in that scheme, but let's say we go way beyond the spheres even, when we're talking about the Ein Sof, the essence of God himself, we can even there, weirdly enough, we can actually say that within that Ein Sof, within the essence of God, that what we call the infinite, the Ein Sof, there is Malchus. There's Malchus of Ein Sof, which is really where all of creation originates from. So this is why we can see, again, there's a connection, like the word Malchus, sovereignty, and Keter, crown, are somewhat interchangeable in a sense. Why do I mean in a sense? Because it depends on your perspective. And from one perspective, it's like sort of like those pictures, right? That it's like you look at them from one perspective, it looks like an old lady. From another perspective, it looks like a young woman. So for one perspective, the same attribute could be Malchus. From another perspective, it can be Keter. So we see that here in this case, says the Alter Rebbe, like Malchus of Atzilus is Malchus. It's Malchus of Atzilus, right? But in another way, when you look at it from below to above, it's called Keter. It's called crown. Now it's become the crown. What we've learned so far is that this power of Malchus, this is where the power of real creation, Ex Nihilo, comes from, is from this power of Malchus, which becomes the highest rung of the lower world below it. Okay, now we're going to talk about the creation of souls. So in order for there to be souls that are really their own entity in the world of Bria, because the world of Bria is where you actually have, so the world of Atzilus, we talked about again many times, that's the world of emanation. There's nothing really separate from God. It's just like emanating from God. So everything in the world of Atzilus is pretty much nullified in its source. It's still like in the realm of potential, like we talked about, like in the creation of a child. The world of Atzilus is just the potential of the child as it exists within the body of the mother and father before they've actually united. But when we come to the world of Bria, that's when conception has happened. Now there is a conception of a child, what we call a zygote, right? It's like the fertilized egg. So now it's that it exists. There's a thing that's there that's not the father and that's not the mother. Yes, it's still within the body of the mother for sure and all of that, but you can't say that it's nullified to the mother in the same way that her eggs were before. You know, now it's a fertilized egg, so there's a piece of the father in it, and it has a separate entity of its own. And so that's what Bria is. Bria is this initial, like, now there is something. It's an actual thing that is separate, so to speak, from God. So now we're talking about this creation of the souls, for them to be this thing, this separate thing in the world of Bria. So the Alter Rebbe says that this is called a Leda. This is called a birth. So it's a very apt imagery to think about birth. It's actually called birth. And it's likened to the splitting of the sea, which the splitting of the sea, the way that it explains in the Zohar about the splitting of the sea is that it's dependent upon Atik. Ba'atika Talia, it's called. So Atik, again, if you've been following, Atik is this level of Keter, this level that is the highest, it's above Chokhmah. And so again, we see here once again that the end is wedged in the beginning. So this Leda, this birth, is dependent on the highest level of Atik. And now the Alter Rebbe says that this is the whole idea, that there's this concept that there's a growth of the souls for 9 months from the zivug, from the union of Shmini Atzeret until the Shvi Shel Pesach. So what happens, so we have Shmini Atzeret, the holiday of Shmini Atzeret is actually coming up pretty soon. So there's this Kabbalistic concept that there's a union that happens on Shmini Atzeret. And this union that happens on Shmini Atzeret, it causes this conception of a soul, of souls, different souls. And this conception of the souls, then it's like it goes through just like a physical woman is pregnant for 7 to 9 months. So there's this, why 7 to 9 months? So this is an idea that's written about in Kabbalah that the minimum amount of a pregnancy, of a healthy pregnancy, is actually 7 months. It doesn't have to be 9 months. It's actually 7 months. So, or it could be 9 months, but 7 is sort of like the minimum amount. So there's something about 7 months that's like a full term of pregnancy. So from Shmini Atzeret till the 7th day of Pesach is 7 months. And so during that time, what's happening is that there's this growth of the Zer Anpin and the nukva in the stomach of the supernal mother. So little abstract there, but the basic idea is, again, Zer Anpin is the 6 emotive attributes. The Nukva is Malchus. So together you have 6 emotive attributes, and Malchus is 7. So there's this growth of these neshamos. They're developing through this time. So Shmini Atzeret, they're conceived, and then for the 7 months, they go through this development that goes through the stages of the 6 emotive attributes and the 7th Malchus attribute in the stomach of the supernal mother. And this whole process happens, says the Alter Rebbe, through the lights, the supernal lights that come from the supernal mother, and from even way above this until we get to the point of the Ein Sof, the infinite one, meaning God himself, that is vested within her, within this supernal mother, for all of these 9 or 7 months of birth. So to be totally honest with you guys, I'm not 100% sure what this is referring to exactly, but it seems like there's some kind of spiritual union that happens on Shmini Atzeret, and then some kind of birth that happens on Shvi Shel Pesach. I'm sure maybe if any of you know a little bit more about this, I'd love to hear about it if you want to put any information about that in the comments. But they're just basically just to kind of know that's the Alter Rebbe brings that up here. And he says that this whole process, this is just like, he likens this to what happens in the creation of the souls and the angels in the world of Bria. That and so too, the mainstay and the source of the seminal drop that Malchus receives is and becomes impregnated by from the Zer Anpin, which is from the minds of the mother and father. So basically, my understanding, I think what's going on here basically is that we're explaining like this whole focus is on Malchus, and Malchus is the birther. It's the one that gives birth to this something from nothing kind of thing. But there's a bunch of spheros that come before that, right? And it's basically just kind of making this connection between all of them. And it's saying that like the impregnation, while the birth happens through Malchus, that, creation, something from nothing happens through Malchus, the impregnation happens as a result of it unifying with the 7 spheros before it, the Zer Anpin, which they are coming from. They get their power from the mochin, from the minds, in the mother and father. And in every zivug, every union, or really literally it's like intercourse, then is drawn down into the supernal mother and father from the levels of Erich Anpin and Atik Yomin, which are the level in Keter, and from above that, from the Ein Sof, like those high levels are drawn down through this union of the mother and the father. So basically, like the union of the mother and father, if my understanding is that the union of the supernal mother and father, which, what does that mean, the union of the supernal mother and father? That's the union of Chochmah and Bina, because Chochmah and Bina are the 2 intellectual attributes are called mother and father. And so when they unify, when Chochmah and Bina unify, within the world of Atzilus, I believe we're speaking of here, that causes the drawing down of lights that are above it from the level of Erich Anpin and Atik Yomin, which are Keter, and even from way, way, way above that. So they're drawing down these very, very deep lights. But what happens is, okay, we have this union of the Abba and Ima, the union of the Chochmah and Bina, but it still stays within concealment within the mind until the actual birthing that happens in the Nukva, in the feminine. And that gives birth to the souls and to the angels and to the Hechalos, the chambers that are found in the world of Bria. And this is the actual revelation of the Or Ein Sof through the pregnancy and through giving birth. So that's the end of the section. So once again, kind of a heavy one today, but the basic idea, my understanding of what we're talking about here again, is that yes, there's this whole process that happens. Like there's a bunch of different spheres that are at play in terms of the drawing down of God's energy and light and things like that. But in order for this light to actually be manifest in such a way that there is a creation of something, that it actually becomes a real thing, a real substance, we need that level of Malchus. Malchus is what brings that about. And Malchus is the connector. Because what happens with Malchus is Malchus unites with the spheres above it, specifically through the Zer Anpin, which are getting their energy from the Chochmah and Bina, or Av V'Em, and they're drawing down light from even higher than that. So Malchus unites with the Zer Anpin, and then Malchus creates the something for nothing, because Malchus then becomes the Keter for the world that is below it, for the crown that is below it. So that's it for today. I know, once again, kind of esoteric. I tried to bring it down with some discussion about the royal family. I hope that helped. And once again, maybe the biggest takeaway that you take from this is just to pique your interest and curiosity in understanding just how deep and complex these ideas in Chassidus are, and make you want to learn more and explore more on your own. There's a lot more to learn, just to an infinite level, really. The more I learn, the more I realize just how much I don't know and how much there is to learn. And we will continue along those lines tomorrow. We still have a few days in this epistle, so we're really going to keep getting deeper into these concepts. So stick with it, and I look forward to continuing with you tomorrow, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.